Hello, folks. We're down the line once again from Boston tonight with political author, analyst, and historian Dr. James D. Boyes. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the American Chronicle.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. China has total respect for Donald Trump and for Donald Trump's very, very large brain.
What is the evidence that it has a preventative effect?
Here we go. You ready? Here's my evidence. I get a lot of positive calls about it.
Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back.
It's Monday, June 29th, 2020. It's episode 15 of the American Chronicle, and it's the last in the series for James and I this side of a summer interregnum. Tonight, we ride the waves of air once more, considering the ongoing tensions among the hitherto Trump-friendly media outlets, the alleged breaking news of Russian-paid bounties on US and UK troops in Afghanistan, political strategy for the summer portions of both Biden and Trump campaigns, and the political scene James and I will most likely encounter upon our September return. A favourite Clive James story of mine relates to Frank Sinatra. Charged with introducing the vocalist on stage, Clive set about penning a tour de force over 48 hours of historical sweep and oratorical prowess. Upon submission of said tour de force for approval, Sinatra's team responded thus: "Say this, and only this. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Sinatra." Carried away by the kinds of oratorical prowess inspired by a last-in-the-series episode of a podcast born of lockdown unrest and storm-tossed politicking, I find cause this evening to remind myself of this story, and therefore, for the last time this season, beginning on the subject of Fox News and Trump, I say this, and only this. Magnificent eardrums, Dr. James D. Boyes.
It's generally acknowledged, I think, that Donald Trump has had a terrible week here in the United States politically for a whole variety of reasons. He has had setbacks at the Supreme Court. He has had setbacks in terms of his public persona, setbacks with regard to the coronavirus and spikes in the figures of that virus in places like Florida, for example. Combine that with a whole host of problems he's now having with Fox News. As you rightly point out, Tucker Carlson, who has been an obvious supporter of the president throughout his administration, has taken to the airwaves to basically say that Donald Trump is now facing an uphill battle for re-election. He has laid out in his own show a series of points reminding viewers about why it was that Donald Trump was supported in the first place. And yet now, through to a combination of the COVID virus, the Black Lives Matter movement, the state of the economy as a result of that, Carlson is now suggesting that Donald Trump is facing a rearguard action for a second term. That is hardly surprising when you see the opinion poll ratings, which show his opponent, Joe Biden, up by some 14 points across the board nationally. I'm always trying to remind everybody that there is no national poll in the United States. This was a mistake that many people fell into, of course, some 4 years ago. But even when you break this down on a state-by-state basis, which is the only way that you should, of course, look at American elections, you see Joe Biden leading in some battleground states in polls at this point by double digits, in some cases by more than 20 points. These are the states, of course, that Donald Trump won last time, admittedly by a very slim margin in some cases. If he is indeed this far behind at this point in the race, then that is a very dangerous position for Donald Trump to be in. Of course, he began campaigning for a second term in office on his first full day in office back in January 2017. You would have thought, therefore, that one of the most obvious things to have ready was an answer for what it is that he would want to do in a second term, especially when that question is put to him by his most prevalent cheerleader, Sean Hannity, who is very much the president's mouthpiece in some respects, I guess, on Fox News. And yet when presented with the ultimate softball question about what his top priorities were for a second term, he simply couldn't answer the question. He talks about experience. I'm going to give you a little bit of list of what he says. Well, one of the things that we really grade, the word experience is still good. I always say talent is more important than experience. I've always said that, but the word experience is a very important word. And this is just remarkable. He went on to talk about John Bolton's books, suggesting that, some people make mistakes, like an idiot like Bolton. All he wanted to do is drop bombs on everybody, and you can't drop bombs on everybody. You don't have to kill people. Well, guess what? Everybody knew this about John Bolton long before he was hired by Donald Trump. It's interesting because the president's response to Hannity was so poor that it has reminded many people of an interview that Senator Edward Kennedy gave to an American TV journalist called Roger Mudd back in 1980, when Senator Kennedy was offered a similar question about why it was that he wanted to be president. And Teddy Kennedy's answer was seen to be long, rambling, and unfocused. It was generally acknowledged to be a poor answer. And the only thing that saved him that night was that his interview was going out at the exact same moment that the TV network premiere of Steven Spielberg's movie Jaws was being shown. So thankfully more people were watching a shark attack the beaches of the fictional Amity Island than were listening to their future potential president, Teddy Kennedy. In this day and age, of course, you cannot get away from Donald Trump's stumbling answer, because it is, of course, doing the rounds and being rerun and reshown on various networks and on social media. So we really are in a bad time for Donald Trump in terms of polls, perception, and his inability to answer a straightforward question. However, as I'm sure you'd expect me to remind everybody, we have seen candidates such as being Joe Biden's position, i.e. this far ahead, this early, and still go on to lose to their opponents. So Joe Biden really should not be counting his chickens, and his supporters should continue to act, frankly, as though they were 10 points behind and not potentially some 14 points ahead.
We're going to need a bigger boat. In terms of that Tucker Carlson moment, drilling in a little more, what's the purpose of someone like Carlson saying that, knowing that he's communicating to the president and knowing the audience base to whom he's communicating on Fox News?
I think that what Carlson is doing, along it must be said with a host of other individuals of a similar ilk, are trying to do several things. I think they are trying to send a warning shot to the White House to basically say, look, what's going on? This is what got you elected. This is why you were elected. You were warning about China, for example. You were right about that in their view. You were right about a whole host of issues. You were right about the need to get people onto the Supreme Court. There are valid reasons why you were elected. Why are you not sticking to those issues? Why are you not governing in the manner in which you promised to govern? It's not, I think, that these people have a fundamental disagreement with the policies of this administration, but merely the practices of this president, who appears at this point to be totally disconnected from reality. There is a whole host of issues which are afoot in the land, about which Donald Trump seems to have no grasp or sense of, quite what it is that is going on or how he should be doing it. In terms of being president, there is a sense of being leaderless, rudderless. Donald Trump couldn't even seem to make his mind up this weekend about whether to play golf, on which of his golf courses he should play. At one point, he was going to be going to New Jersey, I believe, to play golf. Then he said he was staying in Washington. Then he decided to play in Virginia. It's just, I mean, I guess you can have too many golf courses ultimately, which it's always a major problem for me. I know, it's which golf course am I going to play on this week? And here we are. We are in the midst of the most serious civil unrest in this country since at the very least the late 1960s and early 1970s. We really are in the midst of not only a pandemic, but also an epidemic of heightened tension in the land. And there is no leadership in any sense of direction coming from the White House with regard to any of this. The president seems to be totally adrift. And this is the message, I think, which is coming from the likes of Tucker Carlson here in the United States, which is just lead. Just lead. The American people want leadership. And quite frankly, if Donald Trump came out and provided it, I'm sure they would believe that they would see a spike in his numbers. Quite frankly, they can't get a lot worse. I mean, his numbers have never been particularly strong. But the silent majority that he talks of in his tweets, echoing Richard Nixon, of course, I'm quite sure would respond well to a sense of leadership and, dare I say it, decorum from the president. And yet they're not seeing it. So, he is yielding the ground to the Democratic Party at this point, who are very swift to defend and support the Black Lives Matter movement. The right are almost silent on this at this point. And if you're running for the Senate, you've got to be very concerned. I would have thought there is a growing perception that the Democratic Party could very well sweep the board, maintain control of the House, take control of the Senate. And if the presidency is now suddenly within their sight, you could see a huge sea change here in the United States come November. And with the mood in the country, with the people on the streets at this point, with the levels of unemployment, that could be a potentially revolutionary shift politically come January next year if we have a Biden presidency combined with a democratically controlled House and Senate.
I'll come to that sea change in a moment, but unpicking your answer there, you mentioned the setbacks that befell Donald Trump this week and the general void of leadership, as it were. I'm very keen to hear your take on the story out of the New York Times that bounties were put on the heads of US and UK troops in Afghanistan by the Russians. Trump reportedly knew about this since early spring, though, of course, avid fans of this show will know by now how little Trump pays attention to such intelligence briefings. Somewhat lamentably, then, I find myself once again asking, how might this revelation come to bear on this particular hour of political history?
So not for the first time, and I'm sure not for the last time, we find a story about the Trump administration leading all the way back to the gates of the Kremlin. In this case, the report that Russian intelligence and the GRU institution have been offering reward money to the Taliban to kill American and British forces in Afghanistan. Now, this is clearly a remarkable report, made all the more so by the fact that it's been suggested that Donald Trump was advised about this, briefed about this some time ago in the spring. Now, if of course that is true, if both elements of this are true, then that is a truly remarkable situation to find oneself in, because not only would you have Russia now offering a bounty on the heads of American and British armed forces. But the idea that an American president would sit on this story, not respond to it, and not offer a condemnation of Russian activity. This, of course, is just the latest in a long line of stories which have come out, which kind of tell the same story, which is that Russia vehemently betraying American security or American interests, the president knowing full well about it, being briefed by his security staff, and choosing to do nothing and believe the Russians. We saw this, of course, at the press conference in Helsinki several years ago now, when President Trump admitted that he was more inclined to believe Putin over his own national security team. And now we see it in this instance. So hardly surprisingly, the Russians are denying this, but I suppose in the famous words of Christine Keeler, they would say that, wouldn't they? The White House press secretary, who in her first press briefing said, of course, that she would not lie to the American people, has now said effectively that her statement does not speak to the merit of the alleged intelligence, but to the inaccuracy of the New York Times story about whether the president had been briefed or not. Of course, you don't have to read between the lines too far to realize that the press secretary's statement didn't actually deny the validity of the story about what the Russians were up to, but merely tried to pour cold water over the New York Times reporting of that situation. So it really is. You know, I struggle sometimes because I fear that listeners might think, well, here we go again. It's this. It's another week and a similar story, and they would be, quite right for thinking so. You know, it feels that we are in a very strange loop in many ways. Another week, another story that would dominate any other presidency, potentially doom another presidency, and yet for whatever reason, Donald Trump doesn't just seem to be able to survive this, but people just don't seem to want to talk about it. It's becoming very clear, I think, that whenever stories of this ilk emerge, Donald Trump goes into a series of planned responses, which is deny, debunk, insult, and then issue some remarkable statement that turns everybody's attention to something else and away from the story at the heart of the matter. We've seen that countless times across the Trump presidency. I guess what we'll be telling is come November, when we reconvene and start analyzing the lead up to the American presidential election, is the extent to which are the American people suffering from Trump fatigue in the same way that it was suggested that they were suffering from Clinton fatigue. One scandal after another, one series of debacles after another, too much drama, too little government. And that, I think, will be telling come Election Day.
You mentioned therein the loop that we've found ourselves in as willing participants in this cavalcade of catastrophe, if you will. We began this series in the opening throes of a pandemic-induced lockdown. That central narrative has shifted, of course, subsequently. I'd like to turn then towards that which is prefixed, as it were, in the political machinations ahead as we look to the autumn, and of course you and I take our leave in the meantime. So over the summer, over the next 2 months, what is fixed to unfold while you and I are off the air?
So in the coming months, there are going to be a series of events and decisions which we know about in advance because they are effectively set in stone. In any other year, we would be now looking forward to the conventions, which both parties would be holding in a large arena, and they would be the center point of the presidential election to this point, a large gathering with the accompanying razzmatazz, which so many people rightly associate, understandably, with the American presidential season. The extent to which that is going to happen this year is still in doubt. The Republican Party, at least the last time I saw, and this is a constantly changing story, I should point out, was still planning to hold such an event, potentially on 2 sites, and to have everybody attend in a similar fashion as they would have done in any other year. The Democrats are taking a different approach, and again, I put this out here under the basis that this is a changing story.
Of course.
Are now planning not to necessarily meet, but instead to have effectively a virtual conference. Let's wait and see how that happens, because of course there will be pressure for a variety of reasons to hold a real-time event. Suffice to say, both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, will meet in one fashion or another to nominate their candidate. That will, of course, be Donald Trump for the Republicans and Joe Biden for the Democrats. We know, as of today at the very least, that Donald Trump's running mate will be Mike Pence, unless he decides to throw a real curveball in there for some reason or another, perhaps to try and improve the ratings. Maybe he'll fire him. Who knows? This is someone who likes to fire people, of course. But,
definite ratings winner, if that's
definite rating. Well, it would be a remarkable move. I mean, if Donald Trump's figures continue to be as low as they are, he might well look around and think, well, I need to blame someone, and he likes to blame people. Could he possibly blame Mike Pence for his poor ratings? If he did, well, he might bring someone else in. But let's assume for a moment that normality prevails for once and that Pence remains the running mate for Donald Trump. Joe Biden, of course, is the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. We have spoken many times over the course of the past several weeks about who his vice presidential running mate might be. We are, as of today, I'm afraid, still really no closer to being able to name anybody with any certainty. There is some thought that he is more rather than less likely to name a woman of color to that position, although, of course, that's not guaranteed at this point. Those will be the major issues that take place between now and September. The official anointment of Trump and Biden as the 2 prospective candidates, the confirmation of their running mates, and the speeches which both men will give, which will kick off the full election season, beginning on Labor Day, effectively moving into the final scenes, heading into the election in November.
Staying on the campaign trail for a moment, I'd like us to lean in to our political strategist chops. Karl Rove this week held up a whiteboard on broadcast television, always a bad move in the age of Photoshop, with 3 things Trump should do and prioritize if he is to win re-election. Number 1, what's the agenda of a Trump second term? Number 2, what are the ways Trump can contrast with Biden and his policies? And coming in at number 3, run ad hominem attacks on Joe Biden. If you were advising both Trump and Biden this summer, how would Rove's points inform your strategy? And what else would you seek to influence and impart for both candidates?
So it's interesting. I mean, Karl Rove is hardly a beloved figure by the American left for obvious reasons. This was Bush's brain, the architect of George W. Bush's presidential success. And yet, how can you argue with his summary there, quite frankly? Because let's analyze that. Point number 1, set the agenda. Donald Trump is the president of the United States. He has the apparatus of power at his disposal. He has the remarkable ability to set the stall within which this election will take place. He has far greater ability to do that than Joe Biden does. The office of the presidency affords that. Donald Trump's personality exacerbate that. In that regard, Joe Biden is at a distinct disadvantage. Point two, basically set out the rationale for your election and differentiate yourself from Joe Biden. Well, absolutely. Present what this election is all about. Tell the American people why it is that you are best placed to do that, and by extension, dismiss Joe Biden and all that he stands for. This is very straightforward, uncomplicated politics, quite frankly. The problem you have, however, is that list inverts Donald Trump's natural predilection for how to do anything. Because his way of doing things would be point number one, attack Joe Biden. Point number two, attack Joe Biden. Point number three, attack Joe Biden. And perhaps if there was any time left at the end, point number four, attack Joe Biden. Let's not worry too much about things like issues and setting the agenda and trying to paint a pretty picture of what this election is all really about. Because I think Donald Trump has demonstrated, it must be said, time and time and time again throughout this entire process, that he wins when he attacks. And one of the challenges, I think, with trying to critique Donald Trump's political style is that it's been remarkably successful. I don't agree with much that he says or much that he does or how he does it. But, that old line about, you don't teach an old dog new tricks. This is a man in his mid-70s who has run for the presidency properly once and won. And he won by doing things his way, in the words of Frank Sinatra. Why on earth would he change at this point, from his point of view? He won the presidential nomination in 2015-16 by attacking his Republican opponents in a visceral, personal fashion. He won the 2016 presidential election by similarly attacking Hillary Clinton. And in his view, he will do the same with regard to Joe Biden. Now, whether that works or not, we will know come November. But at this point in time, Donald Trump is going to continue to be Donald Trump. And anybody out there who honestly thinks that he's going to change his stripes effectively in the coming 4 months, I think he's misguided, because he will look at this and think, I'm the president, I was elected, yes, you can advise me, but what do you guys really know? Where were you 4 years ago? I've been successful, I believe I'm successful. And this, of course, is exacerbated by the fact that Donald Trump really only seems to talk to people who like Donald Trump. He's not talking to or come into contact with critics. And anybody who disagrees with him, of course, finds that it is a very, very short walk down the White House drive and onto the other side of those gates. We've seen this repeatedly. People like, most recently, John Bolton, of course. We've seen it with 3 or 4 of his White House staff, defense secretaries, secretaries of state, you name it. The turnover in this administration has been remarkable. Why? Because there have been people who have disagreed with Donald Trump about issues of policy and politics, and they have found ultimately that there is only the space for one person's opinion in this White House, and that is Donald Trump. So any attempt to suggest that he should change his approach to politics at this point is going to be misguided. Should he? Probably. If you look at his opinion polls, if you look at how he's doing in key states, I think that what Donald Trump needs to do to secure a second term is to provide leadership. Again, take the policies away from this. If he was to merely to stand up and provide leadership and a sense of direction, I think that many people in many swing states would respond well to that. Joe Biden is at a severe disadvantage in this election in theory. He has no obvious platform to speak from. That has been taken away from him because of the coronavirus. And yet we are seeing the repeat of a very odd phenomenon that we saw 4 years ago, which is the candidate who is seen to be speaking less and has less light on them appears to be doing better. We saw this 4 years ago, and we are seeing somewhat of a repeat of it now. Joe Biden has really said very little and done even less. And yet simply by the fact that he is not Donald Trump at this point, he is getting political mileage from that. The extent to which that can continue into November and into Election Day will be telling, because of course, before that, in theory at least, we have the small matter of the presidential debates.
Yes.
Now there is nothing fixed about that. They are not guaranteed. There is nothing in law that says these have to occur. There is nothing that says how many have to occur. Many people believe that they have occurred every 4 years since Jack Kennedy debated Richard Nixon in 1960. That is not true. There was a gap between 1960 and 1976, for example. There were no presidential debates in 64, 68, or 72. And frankly, Gerald Ford must have wished to his stars that there hadn't been one in 1976, because he made a terrible faux pas in that presidential debate, which helped lead to his defeat. So the extent to which Joe Biden can basically keep quiet and let Donald Trump run his mouth off and get himself into trouble is probably the very, very best political advice one could give to Joe Biden at this point.
In terms of character there, you say to let Donald Trump keep on being Donald Trump. To what extent then would you advise Joe Biden to keep on being Joe Biden insofar as he's presently portraying his ethos? And how would you advise him to handle his run's association with Obama and to a lesser extent the comparatives with Hillary's 2016 run in this contemporary political theatre?
Yeah, one of the things that is given far too little attention, frankly, is what do both campaigns need to do to win come November? Well, what Donald Trump needs to do is to maintain his support in the exact states that he won last time round. In other words, he needs a repeat of 2016 at the very least. People forget that he won in very odd circumstances. He lost the popular vote by 3 million and won the Electoral College by a margin of 70,000 votes across 3 states. He had the most ridiculously narrow needle that he had to try to thread, and he managed to do it in a manner in which most people thought was not possible. He needs to maintain that level of support at the very least if he wants to win a second term. At the moment, the opinion polls in those key states that he needs to win, places like Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, are looking very, very poor for Donald Trump. Even in Texas, last polling I saw put Joe Biden within 1 point of Donald Trump. That is remarkable and needs to be underscored, quite frankly. What Joe Biden needs to do to win the presidency is basically what Barack Obama did in 2012, which was, of course, Hillary Clinton's game plan all along. One of the reasons that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 is not because there was a spike in Republican turnout, because there was not. It was because there was a decline in turnout for the Democratic ticket across the land. That is often put down to, in part, the African American community staying home and not coming out to support a ticket that did not have Barack Obama at the top of it. It's also, I think, important to remember that perhaps many people believed simply that Hillary Clinton's election was an inevitability. So why bother to vote? Surely Donald Trump was not going to win. We will not bother to vote. It's not worth my time. Well, you pays your money and you takes your chances. And hopefully Americans now learn that if you don't vote, you end up with unexpected results. And I imagine, I would hope at least, that those people who perhaps chose to sit out the 2016 election for whatever reason will have realized that if they do so again, they are doomed, in their views, I guess, to have history repeat itself. So Joe Biden needs to take the battle to Donald Trump. He needs to merely win one or two more states than Hillary Clinton won in 2016 to prevail. And at this point, I appreciate that we are speaking in late June, and a lot can happen between now and November. But certainly, things are looking very promising for Joe Biden in states such as Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Those key battleground states that everybody expected Hillary Clinton to win last time round, which she lost very narrowly in some cases, and at which at this point Donald Trump is losing to Joe Biden by double-digit figures. So Joe Biden needs to keep doing what he's doing. He only needs to do only slightly better in the Electoral College than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. And if he does so, then Donald Trump will indeed be looking at a one-term presidency.
I'm compelled to find it quasi-appropriate after your Burgess Meredith to Stallone-esque strategy tips there to talk broad principles now of the frustrated nature of American politics as we approach the close of this evening's show. A line of yours that has struck with me since our first 2016 election interviews together relates to the manner in which the US political system is designed to frustrate, not enable, flow of any description. As I listen back across the series that we're coming to complete this evening, I think of presidents running for second terms and their example. I think of Nixon's run in 1972, for example, the fact that he was brought down shortly thereafter, and the fact that it was a Republican-led initiative that ultimately forced the call. Barack Obama said, of course, change has come to America, but given the systemic frustrations and money-driven nature of US electoral dynamics, to what extent is any candidate of any party ever able to assert mission accomplished, as it were, on the transformation of the nation?
So one of the oft-repeated mistakes which all too many Europeans and especially members of the European press make is that they look at the American system of government and they see the apparent disconnect between the White House, between the Senate, the House, and the courts, and assume mistakenly that somehow the system is broken because things are not happening or because there is this continuing disconnect. And yet this betrays, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of how it is that politics in America works. This is not a Westminster model. There is, under the Constitution, very clear separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches of government. And if things are not happening, it is simply because the system is designed to ensure that that is the way it's meant to be. It is designed to frustrate, not facilitate, the passage of legislation. And we see that time and time again. We see that in the apparent breakdown between the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court. Just this week, for example, we have seen decisions in the Supreme Court go against the White House. I raise this because, of course, if you look at the breakdown of the membership of the Supreme Court with its 5-4 Republican majority and being led by a conservative appointed Chief Justice in the form of John Roberts, I think many people in Europe would suggest, well, of course it's going to go Republican every time and give the White House exactly what it wants. But that is simply not the case. And we've seen that played out this week, for example. A key decision by the Supreme Court to basically make the case that you cannot be fired for being gay now. So the idea that gay rights are being protected within the workplace. I'm sure that many people in Europe would have thought, well, this is a decision which is bound to go against the gay community when it came to a decision in the Supreme Court being made by Republican appointees. So this idea that there is a system in place in America that within which American politics has to work, which is very different from the Westminster model, from European politics, is something which I think far too many people outside of America don't give credit for. What that does mean, however, is that change is very difficult to instigate within the American system of government. This is something which, of course, Barack Obama learned the hard way. It's the easiest thing in the world is to campaign on a pledge of change. This is something which, of course, became synonymous with Barack Obama. He is merely, however, the latest candidate to campaign pledging change for America, and only the latest American president to serve 2 terms at least, to discover how very difficult it is to deliver change. Donald Trump promised to drain the swamp. Well, the swamp is still intact. Donald Trump pledged to replace and repeal Obamacare. Well, he has removed portions of it, but Obamacare is still in place in America. Donald Trump has promised to build a wall across the Mexican border. Well, guess what? He hasn't managed to do so. The reason he has not managed to do so, the reason he has not managed to abolish Obamacare, the reason he has not managed to drain the swamp is because of the pre-existing system which is in place in the United States, which is fundamentally change averse. It is designed to frustrate the legislature and the executive from getting their own way all of the time. And as President Trump has learned, even when you have a solid Republican majority in the Senate, that is no guarantee that the Senate will vote to do your bidding because of the very diverse nature of memberships within political parties, both of the Democrat and the Republican Party. Means that if you go too far to either extent of the political spectrum, you lose a vital component within the center of American politics, meaning you don't get a majority to support your position in the legislature, which means it's very difficult to govern except by executive decree. And of course, Barack Obama, in the eyes of Republicans, was seen to have relied far too heavily upon executive orders. Donald Trump was particularly vocal in his attack of Obama for doing that, and yet he has discovered very quickly upon becoming president that executive orders are a very, very clever way, frankly, of bypassing the legislature to get one's own way. However, as he will likely discover in his eventual retirement, the problem with an executive order is that they only last as long as that executive is in office and can be immediately overturned, which is, of course, why it was that Barack Obama's achievements in foreign affairs, in particular, for example, with regard to Cuba, was so very easy to overcome because Obama had not put the Cuba initiative to any kind of vote in Congress, in the Senate, realizing, frankly, of course, that it would have been doomed on arrival. So the system that Donald Trump and his supporters have spent at least 4 years attempting to drain, is a very real facet of American politics, but it is one which every president comes to Washington vowing to take on, only to realize very quickly, quite frankly, that they are now part of the system, and that if they want to get anything done, they had better work with the system, because attempts to work against the system will lead to a potential one-term presidency.
Thank you, James. You and I have ridden the waves of air long enough for me to know not to boldly ask for political prophecy. But in closing tonight, and for our loyal listeners of the American Chronicle, these 15 episodes, I wondered whether, rather than political prophecy, you could tell me the political world you imagine we'll inherit as we reconvene in September.
I think by the time we speak again in September, all that will be certain is that we will know the names of the candidates that the two parties will have nominated to lead them into the election. We will know the policy positions that they have chosen to advocate. We should have a pretty good idea about the format that the presidential debates will take. And we will know better than we know now the extent to which the coronavirus will impact the coming election in November. Will there have been a second wave of the virus, which many people are fearing across the United States? We will know the extent to which the Black Lives Matter protests will have impacted the policies upon which both parties will decide to fight this election. So there are going to be a series of decisions made in our interregnum between now and when we reconvene in September, which will have direct impacts upon the politics and the policies and the personalities which will go into deciding who the next president of the United States will be.
That's it for this series of the American Chronicle. James and I are forever in your debt as a result of the glorious quantity of feedback and interaction we have received from you for the duration. Further celebrations of this series' achievements would begin to sound positively Trumpian, so I shall attempt to refrain from further such elaborations. Big increases in turnout. Some say maybe the biggest numbers. They've never seen these kind of numbers. With thanks to Chris Warner, as ever, for our theme music, James Boys will return, with questioning noises from myself in the fall. In the meantime, please keep those magnificent eardrums of yours well and safe. I'm Michael L. Roberts. Good luck, now more than ever, and ever onward to you all.